Boston, Massachusetts, January 1919. A city caught between centuries. The cobblestones of the past still echo under the hooves of horses, but the whistle of steam engines and the rattle of streetcars already sing of the industrial future. Factories belch smoke into the winter air, blending with the salt of the harbor and the faint scent of sugar that drifts across the North End. That sweetness comes from one place, a massive gleaming tank rising above the rooftops of Commercial Street. 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, it towers like a monument to the new age. Its steel plates shimmer darkly in the pale light, rivets gleaming like stars along its curved sides. The locals call it simply the Molasses Tank. To the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, it is a triumph of progress, the heart of their purity distilling operation. Inside that iron shell waits more than 2 million gallons of molasses, thick syrup imported from the Caribbean, destined to become industrial alcohol and profit. To the people who live around it, dock workers, teamsters, immigrant families, packed into narrow tenements, the tank is both a curiosity and a background fixture. Children play in its shadow, chasing each other under the elevated railway. Workers lean against its base during lunch breaks, their boots sticking slightly to the ground where the syrup sometimes leaks. They joke about it, tasting the droplets that ooze from the seams. It's sweet, they say, and harmless. But progress has a way of disguising its dangers behind the gleam of efficiency. When the tank was built in 1915, it went up fast, too fast. The war in Europe had created a boom in industrial alcohol, and every day lost meant money gone. The E company didn't wait for formal inspections. The design was rushed, the steel thinner than standards demanded, and the rivets, the tiny metal hearts holding the plates together, fewer than safety required. But the world was at war, and urgency excused everything. The tank went up in less than 4 months. The first time it was filled, the neighborhood noticed something strange. The tank groaned. The steel flexed. Thin streams of dark syrup began to run down its sides, pooling on the ground and drawing swarms of rats. Children laughed and dipped sticks into it. Adults complained of the smell, a sickly sweetness that clung to the air. Workers reported it to their supervisors, but the E company brushed off their concerns. "It's fine," they said, "just settling." They painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Inside, the molasses pressed outward with constant invisible force, hundreds of tons of pressure against every inch of steel. Over time, the metal plates began to strain, and the rivets stretched, each one holding back an impossible weight. The tank was a giant lung that never exhaled, filled to the brim with potential catastrophe. But no one could see that. All they saw was prosperity. By 1919, Boston's North End was a city within a city, crowded, vibrant, chaotic. Italian bakers shouted over the hum of electric streetcars. Fishermen mended their nets by the docks. The smell of salt and yeast and coal dust filled the air. It was a place of survival and hope, where newcomers from Europe chased the American dream one shift at a time. But poverty hung heavy here. Tenement buildings leaned into each other like tired old men. Laundry fluttered between windows. The noise of the factories never ceased. And above it all, the tank stood, a strange industrial guardian watching over the neighborhood. It wasn't beautiful, but it meant work, and work meant life. Few knew what was really inside. Molasses, yes, but molasses that was destined not for kitchens or candy, but for munitions, explosives, and alcohol used in wartime production. The war had ended just months earlier, but the demand for profit had not. The tank remained full, its contents thick and volatile in the winter cold. That January had been bitterly frigid. For weeks, The harbor had frozen over, and icicles clung to the eaves like glass daggers. But on the morning of January 15th, something changed. A sudden warm front swept through New England, melting the snow and filling the streets with damp fog. The air felt heavy and strange, as if the city itself was holding its breath. In the Purity Distilling office, a handful of workers went about their daily routines, checking gauges, preparing deliveries, feeding the horses in the company stables nearby. No one paid much attention to the tank outside. It had stood there for 4 years, leaking but unbroken. There was no reason to think today would be any different. At around noon, a few men noticed something odd. The seams of the tank seemed to shimmer, tiny beads of syrup forming at the rivet holes. One worker, Isaac Gonzalez, frowned as he touched the side. It felt warm, too warm for January. He'd reported the leaks before and been ignored. Still, he muttered under his breath, "One day this thing's going to go." He wasn't the only one uneasy. A clerk across the street in the Boston Elevated Railway office said later he had heard a strange metallic groaning just after lunch. A long, low moan that didn't sound like the trains above. Horses nearby began to shift restlessly, their ears flicking at some frequency beyond human hearing. At 12:30 p.m. the sound came again, louder, sharper, like a gunshot. Then another. And then the world split open. But before the explosion, there was silence, a strange, perfect stillness. Witnesses would later recall that the air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The tank bulged outward, the steel plates bowed. Inside, the molasses was alive, fermenting from the temperature swing, producing gas that built unbearable pressure. The steel had no more give. When the first rivet popped, it shot across the street like a bullet, embedding itself into a wooden beam. The second tore loose, then a dozen more, until the sound became a continuous roar, metal screaming as it ripped apart. The tank's top dome lifted, and in an instant, the entire side gave way. 2 million gallons of boiling viscous syrup burst free. It came not as a liquid, but as a living thing, a wave of black sweetness surging forward at more than 35 miles per hour. The force of it shattered buildings, snapped girders, and tossed freight cars into the air like toys. But those images belong to the next chapter, the moment of impact, the horror that would transform an ordinary Wednesday into legend. For now, Boston still sleeps in its innocence. The people of the North End are unaware that they live beside a bomb disguised as progress. The children playing by the tracks, the policemen chatting on the corners, the horses stamping in their stalls, all of them stand within minutes of disaster. And above them, the tank groans one last time, a sound lost beneath the city's noise. The irony is cruel. The tank had been meant to represent the future, a symbol of industrial power, efficiency, and modern America. Instead, it would become a monument to hubris. Its story was written in rivets and steel, in shortcuts and silence, in the invisible calculus of cost versus safety. When the steel finally fails, the noise will echo across decades. In the archives of Boston's newspapers, the early reports would later read like something from a nightmare. "Molasses tank explodes," the headlines declared. "Flood of syrup sweeps the North End." But in the days before it happened, there were no prophets. No heroes, only ordinary men and women going about their lives. The factory foreman making his rounds, the firehouse crew eating lunch, the delivery driver adjusting his harness. None of them could imagine that within minutes the streets would be buried under a wave of sugar taller than a man. That is how most disasters begin, quietly, in the spaces between complacency and chance. If you stood on Commercial Street that morning, you might have seen the tank gleaming through the mist, massive and still. You might have smelled the sweetness in the air and thought nothing of it. You might have heard the hum of the elevated trains and felt the ground tremble, believing it was only machinery. But beneath your feet, under layers of frost and steel, a catastrophe was gathering. History often turns not on wars or revolutions, but on the smallest human choices. A missing test, a hurried weld, a warning ignored. The Great Molasses Flood was no act of God. It was the sum of those small choices, multiplied over years, until the weight of them became unbearable. And when that weight broke free, Boston would learn that even the sweetest things can destroy. January 15th, 1919. The clock on the wall of Engine 31 firehouse struck 12:30 p.m. when the noise began. A deep, metallic rumble that rolled through Boston's north end like distant thunder. The men inside the fire station paused over their lunch, spoons halfway to their mouths. Outside, a horse reared and neighed in panic. No one yet understood that history had just taken a breath before screaming. The tank on Commercial Street, that enormous steel giant filled to its crown with molasses, was tearing itself apart. Rivets snapped with the sound of machine gun fire. The steel plates bulged, groaned, and then, with a roar that could be heard miles away, the structure exploded. A wall of dark syrup burst forth, a tidal wave of molasses 25 feet, high and moving at the speed of a galloping horse. It glistened under the weak winter sun, a monstrous sheet of brown, churning foam and sticky darkness. In that instant, Boston ceased to be a city of brick and cobblestone and became something otherworldly, a place swallowed by sugar. The first to die were the horses. The Purity distilling stables sat directly beside the tank. 2-ton doors were torn from their hinges as the wave hit, shattering beams and crushing the animals before they could even scream. Then came the people, workers from the north end, yard, children walking home for lunch, sailors loading ships along the wharf. The molasses engulfed them all. Witnesses later described it as a dark wave of death. It moved faster than anyone could run. The pressure of 2 million gallons tore through the narrow streets, carrying with it shards of timber, twisted metal, and pieces of buildings. A freight car was hurled into the air like a toy. A truck was crushed flat. The elevated railway above. Commercial Street shuddered as its steel supports bent under the force. A train just seconds from crossing the weakened span. In the firehouse, Captain George MacDonald barely had time to shout a warning. The waves slammed into the building with a sound like thunder splitting the world. The front wall crumpled inward. The second floor collapsed. Men, equipment, and horses were buried in the sweet, suffocating flood. Inside the chaos, someone cried out for help, the words muffled as the molasses filled the room like rising quicksand. Outside, the street was gone, replaced by a boiling sea of syrup and debris. For those who saw it from a distance, it was like watching a nightmare unfold in daylight. A clerk in the Boston Elevated Railway office described it later. A long, low rumble, then the ground seemed to shake. I looked out the window and saw the entire side of the tank fall outward. The next instant, a wave of dark liquid came rushing toward us, rolling over everything in its path. He barely had time to jump onto his desk as the molasses crashed through the building, flooding the first floor. People tried to run, but the syrup caught them. It was too thick, too heavy. Every step became slower, every breath harder. Those who fell were doomed, trapped, pulled under, their cries silenced by the sticky weight. Survivors later said it was like drowning in tar. One man, Anthony DiStasio, was walking home from school with his sister. The wave lifted him off his feet and hurled him through the air. He later recalled, "Everything went dark and sticky. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank." He survived by sheer luck. The current threw him clear, unconscious but alive. His sister did not. As the flood rolled downhill, it smashed into buildings along Commercial Street, wooden homes, warehouses, the city's electrical substation. Walls splintered and windows burst under the force. The air filled with the stench of molasses and salt water and smoke. People screamed from upper floors as the syrup rose, trapping them inside. Some smashed windows and jumped, hoping to land on solid debris instead of the viscous mire below. At the waterfront, the wave met the sea. There, the energy spent itself, hurling fragments of lumber and broken bodies into the harbor. The water turned brown for hours, thick with sugar and sorrow. When the roaring finally stopped, the city fell silent. All that could be heard was the slow, sickening gurgle of molasses draining between the cobblestones, and the faint, desperate cries of those still trapped. Rescue was nearly impossible. Police officers, sailors, and passers-by rushed to help, but every step was a struggle. The syrup was knee-deep in places, waist-high in others, clinging with the strength of glue. "It pulled at our boots like it wanted to keep us," one rescuer said later. Horses sank and could not be freed. Men used planks and ladders to crawl across the surface, dragging survivors out by hand. The firehouse was a ruin. Inside, the collapsed structure had trapped several firefighters in an air pocket. Beneath tons of molasses, rescuers worked through the night, cutting through beams and debris, their hands raw from the sticky cold. When they finally reached the men, only a few were still breathing. Captain MacDonald was found crushed but alive, gasping through a hole, no wider than a fist. Elsewhere, families searched for missing children, shouting names into the syrup-soaked air. One mother, her skirt stiff with sugar, dug through the debris with bare hands until someone led her away. The smell of molasses hung thick in the air, so strong it made people gag. Even the harbor wind could not carry it off. By evening, the floodwaters had settled into a glistening brown swamp. Broken wagons and splintered beams jutted out like bones. The once white walls of nearby buildings were stained caramel. Reporters from across the city began to arrive, their shoes sticking to the pavement with every step. One wrote that the scene looked as though a giant had poured syrup over the city and stirred. As night fell, electric lamps reflected off the sticky surface, casting ghostly amber light across the wreckage. Volunteers worked with shovels and brooms, trying to clear paths for stretchers. The dead were laid out in rows beside the firehouse, men, women, and children coated in sugar. 21 would never rise again. The injured numbered more than 100, many suffering from broken bones, internal injuries, and shock. Doctors and nurses at nearby hospitals struggled to clean the molasses from wounds. "It was everywhere," one nurse recalled. "In hair, in ears, even in eyes. It clung to the skin like guilt." The following morning, the city awoke to a silence that felt unnatural. The sun rose pale over the harbor, its light catching on the sticky film that still coated every surface. Horses had to be cut free with saws. Workers shoveled the hardened syrup like snow. The air buzzed with flies. For months afterward, Boston would reek of sugar every time the weather turned warm. Newspapers across the country carried the story. "Boston drowned in molasses," one headline screamed. "Sticky horror strikes North End." Reporters compared the disaster to lava, to quicksand, to an avalanche made of sweetness. The irony of it captured the public imagination, that something so harmless, so domestic, could kill with such fury. Dawn broke over a city glazed in sugar. The sun rose pale and cold, reflecting off a crust of molasses that clung to every surface. Walls, cobblestones, horses' manes, even the shattered glass in broken windows. Boston's North End no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like something preserved in amber, Every movement was slow, deliberate, sticky. Rescue crews waded through the hardened syrup as if through melted glass. The smell was everywhere, a heavy sweetness that choked the air and turned stomachs. At first, it had seemed almost pleasant, but by morning, it had curdled into something unbearable. You could taste it in the back of your throat, one policeman later said. Every breath was sugar. The night before had been chaos. The Itaú morning brought grim order. Soldiers from the nearby Fort Banks arrived with shovels and hoses. Firefighters, their boots wrapped in burlap to keep from sticking, used seawater pumped from the harbor to thin the molasses enough to move. Volunteers from across the city joined in. Students, laborers, even sailors from anchored ships. The work was desperate and slow. Every shovel of syrup weighed like stone. Bodies were found in terrible poses. Some had been carried blocks from where they'd stood when the tank exploded. Others were buried beneath layers of hardened sugar and debris. Horses were frozen mid-stride, their eyes wide open beneath the amber glaze. One rescuer said the scene reminded him of Pompeii, a disaster captured in motion, the instant of death preserved forever. At the Engine 31 firehouse, the wreckage still steamed faintly. Rescuers had worked through the night, cutting through beams to reach the trapped firemen. Captain MacDonald, pulled out alive but broken, whispered that he'd heard the walls sing as they collapsed. His men were not so lucky. 4 of them lay beneath the ruins, their uniforms blackened with syrup and soot. City officials ordered makeshift morgues set up along the waterfront. The dead were carried there on stretchers, wrapped in canvas that soon turned dark and sticky. Identification was nearly impossible. Faces bloated, features hidden beneath layers of sugar. Family members searched for days, walking between rows of bodies under the dim electric lights, the air thick with the scent of sweetness and decay. By the second day, the cleanup became an operation unlike anything the city had ever seen. Fire. Engines pumped seawater through hoses, flooding the streets to wash away the molasses. The mixture of sugar and salt created a slick brown foam that ran back into the harbor. Reporters described it as a tide of caramel. Seagulls circled in hysterical swarms, feasting on whatever floated past. Crews spread sand and ashes over the ground to give their boots traction. Still, many slipped, their hands and clothes coated until they glistened like sculptures. Some laughed grimly that Boston had become the largest candy factory in the world. Others simply kept their heads down and worked. The water turned the syrup thin enough to flow, but spread it farther. The harbor itself became a swamp of molasses. Fish floated belly up near the docks. Rats drowned by the hundreds. Tugboats left brown wakes for weeks. The smell carried across the bay to Cambridge. Even months later, a journalist wrote, the taste of molasses lingers on the wind like a ghost. While the working class dug through the ruins, the city's leaders gathered in their offices, seeking answers. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company sent its lawyers immediately, armed with statements and denials. Their first claim was simple, an act of God. No human error, no mechanical failure, just fate. The cold, the heat, perhaps vibrations from a passing train, anything but negligence. But the people of the North End knew better. They had lived beneath the tank's shadow for years, had seen the leaks, had tasted the syrup that seeped from the seams. "We told them," said one resident. "We told them it wasn't safe." Within days, the outcry grew. Newspapers filled with letters demanding accountability. The Boston Post called it the price of industrial arrogance. Politicians promised investigations. Reporters prowled the site, interviewing survivors whose voices trembled between anger and disbelief. "It was no accident," one said. "It was murder by carelessness. Engineers were brought in to examine what remained of the tank. What they found was damning. The steel plates were thinner than code required, some less than half an inch thick. The rivets were brittle, the seams poorly sealed. There was no evidence the tank had ever been pressure tested with water before use, a basic safety step that the company had skipped to save time and money. One engineer, after reviewing the wreckage, said simply, "It was bound to fail. The only surprise is that it lasted this long." The Purity Distilling Company's foreman admitted under questioning that he'd been told to keep the tank full despite the leaks, to avoid interrupting production. He'd even been instructed to paint it dark brown to hide the stains. The revelation infuriated the public. Boston was a city proud of its intellect and progress. To learn that its catastrophe had come not from nature, but from greed felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, life in the North End struggled to resume. Children returned to schools that smelled faintly of sugar. Merchants reopened shops, scrubbing their floors again and again, yet the stickiness never seemed to fade. Dogs tracked syrup into houses. Even months later, shoes would pull slightly from the ground with each step, as if the city itself resisted forgetting. Relief funds were raised for the victims. Churches held services where priests spoke of humility before man-made tragedy. "We cannot undo what has been done," one sermon began, "but we can remember that progress without conscience is no progress at all." Yet remembrance quickly turned to rage. Lawyers representing the families filed more than 100 lawsuits against the company, the largest civil action in Massachusetts history up to that time. For the first time, an industrial giant would be forced to answer in court for the human cost of its negligence. The legal battle would drag on for years. Company attorneys argued that anarchists had sabotaged the tank, a convenient scapegoat in a nation still fearful after World War I. They claimed that Italian immigrants in the neighborhood had conspired to destroy it. No evidence supported the charge, but it poisoned the atmosphere. Immigrant families, already grieving, now faced suspicion from the city they had helped build. Witness after witness testified. Engineers drew diagrams of cracked plates and cheap rivets. Survivors described the wave, the suffocation, the sound of screaming beneath the syrup. Reporters crowded the courtroom, scribbling every word. The company's representatives sat stone-faced, insisting that the disaster was unforeseeable, that the tank had been built to the highest standards. But the truth seeped through, slow and unstoppable, like molasses itself. Outside the courtroom, Boston was changing. The post-war boom had ended. Prohibition was on the horizon. The very product that had made the tank profitable, industrial alcohol, would soon be outlawed. The tragedy became a symbol of a fading era when unchecked industry had reigned supreme. For the people of the North End, though, there was no symbolism, only loss. They still woke to the smell. They still scrubbed their walls. Some swore that even the rats carried a sheen of sugar on their fur, and on humid summer nights, the air grew thick again, heavy with the scent of molasses rising from the cracks of the old cobblestones. "It's like it never left," one woman said years later. "It's still here. You breathe it." As the months passed, the site was cleared. The tank's twisted remains were hauled away, melted down for scrap. In its place, the city built a park, grass and benches where once had stood a mountain of iron and death. Children played there again, laughing as if to defy the ghosts beneath the soil. Yet when they dug too deep, sometimes their shovels struck something hard, a fragment of steel, a rivet, a memory. The newspapers eventually moved on. Other stories claimed the front pages: politics, crime, war in faraway lands. The Great Molasses Flood faded from national memory, reduced to a headline, a curiosity, a punchline in history books. But for Boston, it lingered like a scar that would not heal. The final investigation report would not come for 6 long years. When it did, it was clear and merciless. The tank had failed because it was built too thin, tested too little, and maintained too poorly. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable. The victims' families were awarded more than $1 million, a fortune at the time, but no measure of justice for the lives lost. And yet, something larger had shifted. The case set a precedent for corporate accountability. From that day forward, building codes and safety inspections in Massachusetts became stricter. Engineers began to sign their names to blueprints, taking responsibility for the structures they designed. The price of progress had finally been counted in gallons of syrup and in human lives. By the time the last lawsuits were settled, Boston had rebuilt. The streets of the North End no longer glistened with sugar, but when the wind blew in from the harbor, old residents would still catch the faintest hint of sweetness and pause. They would remember the roar, the darkness, the stillness that followed. And sometimes, when the city grew quiet at night, it seemed they could still hear the groan of steel from beneath the ground, a warning echoing through the decades, reminding all who would listen that even the sweetest dreams can rot from within. Boston, 1920. A year has passed since the flood, but the city still smells faintly of sugar when the air turns warm. The headlines have faded, but the grief has not. Families still light candles for the 21 dead. Workers still scrape molasses from between cobblestones, and in the Suffolk County Courthouse, the echoes of that terrible day return to life, this time in words, documents, and testimony. It would become one of the longest civil cases in Massachusetts history, the Commonwealth versus the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. 119 lawsuits combined into a single proceeding. Families of the dead, the injured, and the displaced stood together, demanding accountability from a corporation that had long considered itself untouchable. The trial would last 6 years. 6 years of arguments, diagrams, experiments, and witness after witness describing what it felt like to drown in sweetness. The courtroom smelled of tobacco, damp paper, and ink, a place heavy with the weight of routine justice. But this case was different. This was not a murder or a theft. This was a reckoning between progress and its price. Judge Hugh W. Ogden presided, a calm, deliberate man, a former Army officer known for his precision. Reporters described him as a surgeon with words. He sat beneath the high ceiling of Courtroom C, hands folded, as lawyers and experts battled before him. On one side, Charles F. Choate, Jr., the lead attorney for the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Smooth, confident, impeccably dressed, he represented the industrial elite of Boston. On the other, a coalition of small-town lawyers and public advocates representing the workers, the widows, the nameless laborers who had lost everything. Among them was William E. Fickett, a fiery voice for the victims, who declared in his opening statement, "This was not an act of God. This was an act of greed." The defense began with denial. They claimed sabotage. In the tense years after World War I, fear of anarchists and immigrants ran deep. The company's lawyers argued that the tank had been deliberately destroyed by foreign radicals, likely Italians or anarchists from the neighborhood. They presented no evidence, only whispers, rumors, and fear. The courtroom murmured at the accusation. The families of the victims, mostly Italian immigrants, sat silent, their faces stony with disbelief. For them, it was not just an insult, but a second wound. They had buried their dead, only to see their names dragged through the mud. "Show us proof," Fickett demanded. There was none. Then came the engineers. Experts examined the remains of the tank. Twisted steel plates, fractured rivets, warped seams. One after another, they testified that the structure had been doomed from the moment it was built. The steel was too thin, brittle under pressure. The rivets were made of low-grade iron, some already cracked before the explosion. A professor from MIT demonstrated before the court how the tank should have been tested, filled with water to check for leaks. He explained that water, unlike molasses, exerts predictable pressure. Had the test been done, the tank would have failed safely before being filled. But it had never been tested. The company had rushed it into service to meet wartime demand. When asked why the leaks had been ignored, one foreman reluctantly admitted, "They told me to paint it brown to hide the syrup." The courtroom went silent. Outside, the newspapers devoured every detail. The Boston Globe ran daily updates. The New York Times sent correspondents to cover the hearings. The story captivated the nation, not for its spectacle, but for what it revealed, the fragility of modern confidence. America had entered the industrial age, believing that science and steel could conquer nature. But here, in the heart of its oldest city, progress had collapsed under its own arrogance. Reporters described the courtroom as a theater of consequence. Each day, the audience filled with dock workers, students, and curious citizens. Some came for justice. Others came simply to see if a corporation could, for once, be made to answer. The victims' lawyers called survivors to the stand. Their testimonies were quiet but devastating. A fireman, his hands still scarred from the burns of that day, described digging through molasses for hours to find his fellow men. "It wasn't water," he said. "You couldn't move in it. Every breath pulled it deeper into your lungs." A mother told how she searched for her son through the wreckage. "They told me he might have been thrown toward the harbor," she whispered. "I found his shoe 3 days later." One child survivor, now a teenager, testified that he could still taste sugar whenever it rained. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke. Reporters noted that even the company's lawyers lowered their eyes. The defense countered with numbers and jargon. They produced blueprints, material logs, and engineers who spoke in monotone about tensile strength and hydrostatic pressure. They tried to bury the story in data, but the facts betrayed them. Every piece of evidence pointed to negligence, a chain of decisions driven by haste and profit. Even the company's own chief engineer, under cross-examination, admitted that he was not a licensed structural designer. He had relied on his judgment rather than scientific calculations. The room erupted. Judge Ogden called for order. "This is not judgment," Fickett thundered. "This is gambling with lives." As the months turned into years, the trial became more than a case. It became a moral parable. Students debated it in universities. Labor organizers cited it as proof that corporations needed regulation. Industrialists in their private clubs called it a dangerous precedent. Judge Ogden listened through it all, meticulous, patient, and silent. He read thousands of pages of testimony, diagrams, and reports. He toured the site of the disaster himself, walking the streets where the tank had stood, where the syrup had flowed. Locals said he stood there a long time, staring at the ground, his shoes sticking faintly to the earth even after years of rain. In the end, he would take nearly a year to write his decision, a document of more than 20,000 words. When the verdict finally came in 1925, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters packed every seat. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. The clerk read the findings aloud. Judge Ogden's voice was steady, unemotional. The tank was insufficient in its design, inadequate in its construction, and neglected in its maintenance. The failure was not the act of providence, nor the work of saboteurs. It was the direct result of human negligence. He ruled that the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was liable for the disaster. The victims' families were awarded over $1 million in damages, equivalent to tens of millions today. Each life lost, each home destroyed, each injury suffered had been measured, counted, and recognized. In the back row, a widow wept quietly. Beside her, a man whispered, "We won," but no one cheered. Justice, they knew, had come too late. The company appealed, of course. They always do, but the decision stood. The case became a cornerstone in American law, the first to establish the concept that corporations bore absolute responsibility for public safety. It led to stricter building codes, standardized testing of industrial tanks, and the birth of modern engineering oversight. In the world beyond the courtroom, few noticed the ripple, but history would. For the families, life moved on. Compensation could buy bread, but not peace. Some left Boston seeking new beginnings. Others stayed, unable to leave the place where their dead still slept beneath the streets. The site of the tank remained empty for years, a scar in the city's skin. Children avoided it at night, whispering that you could still hear the tank groan when the wind blew in from the harbor. By the time the case closed, America had changed. Prohibition had begun. The factories that once churned out alcohol stood, silent or converted to other trades. The age of unregulated industry was fading into the age of accountability. And somewhere in that transformation, the Molasses flood stood as a grim milestone, a reminder that progress without conscience leads only to ruin. Judge Ogden retired not long after the verdict. When asked about the case years later, he said, "Only, there are disasters that change laws, but it is the quiet suffering that changes people." For Boston, the flood became both tragedy and legend. In taverns and classrooms, people told the story, sometimes as history, sometimes as dark humor. "Did you hear?" they'd joke, about the day the city drowned in syrup. But behind every laugh lingered unease. Everyone knew someone whose life had been touched by it. Boston, a century later. The city hums with the rhythm of the modern age, the thrum of the subway beneath the streets, the chatter of tourists at Faneuil Hall, the faint salt in the air that drifts in from the harbor. Glass towers rise where factories once stood. The cobblestones gleam under electric lights. But in the North End, if you walk along Commercial Street on a humid summer day, you might still catch it. A faint, sweet scent, like burned sugar carried on the wind. Locals say that when the weather is right, when the air is thick and the sea mist rolls in from the bay, the ghost of the Great Molasses Flood returns. It clings to the old bricks and rusted railings. It lingers in the cracks between the stones. You breathe, and for just a moment, the city tastes of the past. Today, the spot where the tank once stood is easy to miss. There's a playground there. Now, Langone Park, bright with the sound of children's laughter, the slap of baseballs, the rustle of leaves. A small metal plaque near the fence bears the words, "On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank at this site exploded, sending a wave of molasses through the streets of the North End. 21 people were killed and 150 injured. That's all," it says. No dramatics, no photographs, no spectacle. Just words etched in bronze. A quiet memorial to something almost too strange to believe. But to those who know the story, that little plaque is a portal. It marks not just the site of a disaster, but the birthplace of a lesson, one that would ripple across the century. After the flood, America began to change its relationship with industry. Before 1919, factories rose fast, untested, unregulated. Safety was an afterthought. Profit was the pulse of progress. But the Great Molasses Flood forced engineers, lawmakers, and the public to confront a simple truth: that ambition without accountability was deadly. The case of the collapsed tank became required reading in engineering schools. It was cited in TED legal textbooks, in ethics courses, in safety manuals across the United States. For the first time, engineers were required to sign and seal their designs, taking personal responsibility for the safety of their structures. That idea, accountability, through certification, would become a cornerstone of the profession. The disaster also transformed public oversight. Cities across America began enforcing building codes, pressure testing, and inspection laws. Every bridge, every storage tank, every industrial structure built after 1919 carried, in its design, a trace of that catastrophe. Progress learned to measure itself against memory, but memory fades unevenly. For decades, the flood lived more in rumor than in history. Many dismissed it as a curiosity, a weird local tale told in bars and classrooms. Some thought it an exaggeration, a kind of Boston folklore. The day the city drowned in syrup, the tragedy, stripped of its horror, became a punchline. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to reclaim the truth. They unearthed court documents, survivor testimonies, yellowed photographs showing a neighborhood buried under dark sludge. They read the words of Judge Ogden, the calm, relentless voice of reason in a time of chaos. They spoke with the descendants of victims who still remembered stories passed down like family heirlooms. The day the world turned sweet and deadly. In the 1980s, journalists rediscovered the event and brought it back into public consciousness. Documentaries followed, then novels, museum exhibits, and eventually history lessons in schools. The Great Molasses Flood re-emerged, not as a joke, but as a mirror held up to the modern world. And what a mirror it is. When people today read about the flood, it seems almost unbelievable. A wave of molasses? How could something so ordinary, so harmless, become an agent of destruction? But that's the point. The disaster was not born of chaos. It was born of neglect, of small decisions made in boardrooms, of corners cut to save time, of warnings ignored because they came from workers instead of executives. That, perhaps, is what makes the story timeless. It speaks not only of one tank in one city, but of every system that puts speed before safety, profit before people. Each generation finds its reflection in that sticky wave: the collapse of a dam, the failure of a bridge, the explosion of a plant. Modern echoes of that same old arrogance. As one historian wrote, the Great Molasses Flood is the sound of civilization learning, very slowly, that it must not trust itself blindly. Yet despite its gravity, the story still holds a strange beauty. There is something haunting in the image of a city frozen in sugar, time stopped mid-motion, tragedy preserved in sweetness. The flood feels like an allegory that Boston never asked for, but somehow deserved. A reminder that even the sweetest ambitions can rot when left unchecked. Every few years, someone writes a new book or documentary about the flood. Historians debate details, the tank's pressure, the exact height of the wave, the speed of the syrup. But the core remains unchanged: 21 lives lost to carelessness and a city forever changed. In 2019, on the 100th anniversary, the people of Boston gathered at Langone Park. They read the names of the dead aloud. They stood in silence as the harbor wind carried the faint scent of molasses from some unseen place. No speeches, no spectacle, just memory. One survivor's granddaughter spoke quietly to the crowd. "My grandmother used to say that the smell never left the city. Maybe it's not supposed to." Modern science has studied the disaster too. Engineers recreated the physics of the wave with computer simulations, confirming what witnesses said. That molasses, when suddenly released, moves not like liquid, but like a wall, thick, crushing, unstoppable. At 35 miles per hour, the syrup acted as both flood and avalanche. Temperatures dropped and the mass thickened, trapping everything it touched. Even a century later, researchers used the event to understand how non-Newtonian fluids behave in disasters, knowledge applied to oil spills, mudslides, and industrial safety. In this way, the Great Molasses Flood, born of ignorance, became a tool for understanding, its horror transformed into knowledge, its waste into warning. From the streets of the North End, science itself took a lesson in humility. But beyond science and law, the flood left something quieter, a moral residue. Boston became more than just a site of tragedy. It became a symbol of resilience. The people who lost homes rebuilt them. The families who mourned found work again, raised children, told stories. They turned disaster into folklore, grief into strength. In the old neighborhoods where Italian bakeries still line the narrow streets, the smell of sugar has a double meaning. It is the scent of tradition, pastries and coffee, but also of remembrance. The air carries both life and loss, intertwined forever. One writer once called it a city haunted by sweetness. Perhaps that's fitting. The flood did not destroy Boston's spirit. It revealed it. The same stubbornness that built the city carried it through the aftermath. And in the years since, that same spirit has whispered the same quiet vow: never again. When engineers sign blueprints today, when regulators check a tank's pressure or a bridge's supports, they are in a way answering to the ghosts of the North End. The Molasses Flood lives within every safety code, every inspection checklist, every ethical oath sworn by those who build. Few of them think about it consciously, but its echo is there, a century-old voice saying, test it, check it again, because someone, once, did not. And still, on certain nights when the harbor fog drifts low, locals say the air grows heavy and sweet again. Maybe it's just the bakeries. Maybe it's something else. The earth exhaling the memory it has held for too long. You can almost imagine the sound, a low groan, like bending steel, like the sigh of a century gone by. The city stands still, listening. The ghosts rest uneasily, but they rest. Their story has been told, and in the telling, their suffering has found purpose.